At 3 in the morning, during the harvest season of 1631, a small Irish fishing village was torn from sleep by the sound of splintering wood and human terror. Shadows moved between the cottages carrying torches and curved blades. Within minutes, thatched roofs became pillars of fire, and families who had never travelled beyond the next hill found themselves being dragged toward the black water of the harbour. The raiders spoke a language no one in that village had ever heard. By the time the sun rose over the Irish Sea, 237 souls had vanished, from Baltimore, loaded onto ships like cargo bound for a world they could not imagine. One of them was a girl named Brigid who had spent her entire life within sight of that coastline. She had never seen a city, never held a coin worth more than a few pence, never once considered that her future could be stolen, in a single night, by men from a continent she did not know existed. Weeks later, she found herself standing barefoot on wooden planks in the blazing heat of Algiers, surrounded by crowds who examined her teeth, measured her height, and shouted numbers she could not understand. Brigid became one among more than 1 million Europeans captured across 2.5 centuries and sold into slavery along the North African coast and deep into the Ottoman Empire. For these captives, the Mediterranean was not a sea that separated civilizations. It was an open wound. This is the history that Europe buried beneath silence and shame. Accepting it means confronting a terrifying truth, that for over 200 years entire coastlines from the hills of Ireland to the shores of Italy lived under the constant shadow of Barbary Corsairs, and that countless women were swallowed behind the walls of harems, leaving behind almost no trace of their suffering. In this video we are going to walk beside women like Brigid, examine the machine that consumed their lives, and ask a question that still has no good answer: why did no one come to rescue them? Before we go any further, drop a comment telling me which city and country you are watching from right now, to understand what happened to Brigid and the countless others torn from their homes. You have to understand who took them. The Barbary Corsairs were not desperate outlaws drifting across the waves looking for easy targets. They were professionals. They operated from fortified port cities along the North African coast, places like Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and the Moroccan stronghold of Sale. Behind every raid stood governors who collected taxes, admirals who planned campaigns, and at the top of it all, the Ottoman Sultan himself. Every person dragged off a European shore meant revenue flowing upward through bribes, fees, and official cuts. This was not random violence. This was an industry. Their fleets moved with precision, sometimes a single swift vessel slipping through the night, sometimes entire squadrons of 20 or 30 ships coordinated like wolves circling prey. They studied the coastlines of Spain, Italy, France, and pushed as far as England and Ireland, always searching for the soft spot. They preferred the cover of darkness, a village where people slept with their doors unbarred, a harbour emptied of men who had sailed out to fish, a storm that pinned patrol boats to the docks. That was when they struck. They took everything worth carrying: gold, silver, tools, grain, but the most valuable cargo was always human. A chest of coins could only be spent once. A person could be sold, resold, worked and exploited until nothing remained. Between 1530 and 1780, more than 1 million Europeans were swept up in this tide and dragged across the Mediterranean. Spaniards, Italians, French, Portuguese, English, Irish, Dutch, even isolated farmers from Iceland who had never laid eyes on a proper city. For 250 years, the sea that carried merchants and pilgrims also carried chains. In countless coastal regions, people abandoned the shoreline entirely. Whole villages emptied as families packed whatever they could carry and fled inland, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the water. The rhythm of waves stopped meaning prosperity. It meant terror arriving without warning. The reach of the Corsairs extended further with each passing decade. In 1627 they sailed all the way to Iceland, a frozen edge of the world that most southerners could barely imagine. Around 400 people were seized from settlements so remote they had no idea such enemies even existed. Picture a farmer there, a man who knew nothing but wind and snow and the slow turn of seasons, waking to the crash of his door and the shouts of men speaking a language he had never encountered. They wore unfamiliar clothes, carried curved blades, and screamed commands in Arabic and Turkish. To that farmer, they must have seemed like something conjured from a nightmare. The Italian coast suffered the same fate. In 1544, the legendary Corsair Admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa swept through towns and villages along the shoreline. In a single summer, around 7,000 people were carried away. Entire neighborhoods fell silent within weeks. A decade later, in 1554, another assault struck the Spanish town of Vieste. Roughly 6,000 people vanished from that one place. That is not a robbery. That is a community carved out of existence. One day the streets are filled with voices. The next day the streets are empty and every familiar face is gone. For anyone living near the coast, this fear was woven into daily existence. Every night people lay down wondering if they would wake up free. Fishermen watched the horizon as carefully as they watched their nets. Parents checked on their children again and again, ears straining for any sound outside. Church bells were repurposed as alarms. Watchtowers rose on cliffs and headlands from Portugal to Greece. When a lookout spotted unfamiliar sails, he rang the bell and lit a signal fire. Villagers grabbed whatever they could and ran for the hills, praying they could reach safety before the ships touched shore. Sometimes they made it. Often they did not. The Corsairs adapted constantly. If one village built walls, they simply targeted another. They paid local informants to reveal weak points. They waited for nights of foul weather when patrol ships could not leave port. They attacked during religious festivals when people were distracted by celebration. They kept detailed notes, marking which places had cannons, which had only wooden gates, which harbors were unguarded after dark, which towns held wealthy merchants worth ransoming, and which were filled with the poor fishermen who could be sold cheaply in bulk. And it was not only North Africans carrying out these raids. Some of the most effective Corsairs were Europeans who had crossed to the other side. These renegades converted to Islam, joined the fleets, and used their knowledge of European languages and customs to plan attacks. They could pose as friendly traders, gather intelligence in ports, then return months later leading a squadron of raiders. They knew which churches held silver, which walls were built more for show than defense, which harbors stood unguarded at night. One of the most notorious was a Dutch captain who came to be known as Simon the Dancer. He had started his career sailing under European flags, but later switched allegiance to the Barbary powers and climbed to the top of their ranks. In Algiers he became one of the wealthiest Corsair commanders. He knew Dutch waters, Dutch shipping routes, and Dutch habits. He exploited that knowledge without hesitation. He captured vessels flying the same colors he had once sailed under. Men from his own homeland ended up in chains in the same markets that made him rich. For him, faith and nation were negotiable. Only profit was constant. The flow of captives and coin created an economy built entirely on human misery. Local governors in North Africa took their cut from every sale. Ship owners reinvested profits into faster vessels for the next raid. Blacksmiths forged more chains. Brokers in the markets made their living connecting buyers with new victims. Even former slaves who had somehow gained their freedom sometimes stayed and became traders themselves, trapped in the same machine that had ONCE consumed them. When a system generates that much wealth, it does not collapse on its own. It has to be forced to end. To see how this machine operated at the human level, consider what happened to another young woman nearly a century after Brigid was taken. Her name was Lijsbeth van Rijn, a 22-year-old from the Dutch Republic. In 1731 she was aboard a merchant vessel off the Spanish coast. The voyage was supposed to be routine: deliver cargo, return home, marry her betrothed and begin a quiet life in a quiet town. Then one morning at dawn, the lookout spotted sails on the horizon. At first they assumed it was an escort ship. Then the other vessel raised its true colors and fired a warning shot. Corsairs. They closed the distance fast. Grappling hooks flew across the gap. Armed men poured over the rails. The fight was short and brutal. The raiders were not interested in glory. They wanted merchandise. Any man over 40, anyone who looked too weak or sick to survive hard labor, was cut down and thrown into the sea. The deck became a killing floor. Younger men who might last years, chained to oars, were beaten into submission and dragged below. Every woman on board, regardless of age, was bound with rough rope. Hands tore away jewelry, rings, anything of value. Once the Corsairs had full control, they turned the ship south toward Africa. Lijsbeth was forced into the hold. The space had never been designed for human cargo, but that did not matter. Bodies were packed in anyway. Around 40 women found themselves chained together, wrist to wrist and ankle to ankle, with barely enough room to sit upright. There was no light, no fresh air. The on-L-Y sounds were the groaning of the hull, the slap of waves against wood, and the endless sobbing and prayers spoken in languages Lijsbeth did not recognize. The crossing took 17 days. 17 days without seeing the sky. The waste buckets overflowed. The stench of sweat, vomit, blood and filth saturated everything. Food arrived once or twice a day, hard bread and a little water, sometimes nothing at all. When the sea turned rough, the guards did not bother coming down. Some women tried to stand but were yanked back by their chains. Others collapsed and never rose again. In that darkness, Lijsbeth lost all sense of time. Her only measure was the number of times she heard a body being dragged away. When a woman died, the guards would unlock her shackles and haul her up to the deck. Moments later came the heavy splash of a corpse hitting the water. Lijsbeth counted 7 splashes over those 17 days, 7 women, whose names she never learned, 7 families who would never know what had become of their daughters, sisters, or wives. The woman chained beside her stopped eating on the 3rd day. She refused water on the 5th. By the 8th day she was dead, but Lijsbeth remained shackled to the corpse until someone finally noticed and removed it. When the hatch finally opened and the captives were brought up into the light, the sun cut into their eyes like blades. After so long in total darkness, the brightness of the Algerian coast seemed unreal. Whitewashed walls rising in tiers, tall towers, minarets piercing the sky, crowded harbours thick with ships. Men shouted in Arabic, Turkish and Italian. The air carried the smell of salt, unfamiliar, our spices, sweat and fear. Lijsbeth's first clear view of Algiers was the market where her body would be sold. The process was efficient. The Corsairs had no reason to damage their merchandise. Captives were marched to public baths where workers scrubbed them with rough cloths and cold water. Visible wounds received quick treatment, just enough to keep people alive for the sale. No one wanted a dead slave on the auction block. After the cleaning came the sorting. Strong young men were sent in one direction, toward the galleys and construction sites. Their bodies would be spent building fortifications, rowing warships, and hauling stone under the burning sun. The life expectancy of a galley slave was measured in years, sometimes only months. Disease, exhaustion, or punishment killed most of them before they grew old. Educated captives who knew languages, mathematics, or skilled trades were separated. They commanded higher prices as tutors, scribes, or craftsmen. They lived marginally better, but they were still property. Their knowledge made them valuable. It did not make them free. Children were pulled aside as well, boys and girls young enough to be shaped. Some were destined for domestic service. Others would be converted and raised as Muslims, trained for the military or the bureaucracy. They would grow up speaking a different language than their parents, worshipping in different ways, their original names and origins slowly erased. By adulthood, many would not even remember the place where they were born. Women were divided by age and physical condition. Those over 35 were often assigned to heavy household labor, cleaning large estates, ending grain, hauling water, cooking for extended families. Their days stretched long and exhausting. They slept wherever space allowed. If they became ill or too weak to work, they could be resold cheaply to poorer families or simply discarded. But young women between 15 and 30 were treated very differently. They were considered prime merchandise. These women were taken to raised platforms in the center of the slave markets. Crowds pressed in around them. Prospective buyers circled, examining each body. They squeezed arms and legs to test muscle tone. They checked teeth the way a man might inspect a horse. They studied skin for scars, disease, or any flaw that might lower the price. In many markets, clothing was stripped away entirely. Modesty had no value here. Only profit mattered. Foreign observers who witnessed these scenes were horrified. A French friar named Pierre Dan, who worked in Algiers during the 1630s, helping ransom Christian captives, left detailed accounts. He wrote that Christian women were displayed naked in public squares, prodded and examined as though they were livestock at a country fair. Buyers touched them wherever they pleased, ignoring tears and pleas. If a woman tried to cover herself or pull away, she was beaten in front of everyone until she stopped resisting. The lesson was delivered without subtlety. Your body no longer belongs to you, it belongs to whoever pays the highest price. None of this happened in hidden alleyways. It took place in broad daylight in the center of cities under open sky. Children walked past. These markets on their way to other errands. Local merchants set up stalls nearby to catch the traffic. Officials collected taxes on every transaction. The entire system was legal, normal, and accepted as simply the way things worked, and somewhere in a market just like this one, months earlier, Brigid O'Callaghan had stood on her own platform. A girl from a windswept Irish village where she had known every face, where she had never travelled further than the next bay, now exposed to the stares of hundreds of strangers. She could not understand the language swirling around her. She did not recognize the currency being used to place a value on her body. She understood only that men were arguing, pointing at her, and raising fingers to signal their bids. One of those men was a wealthy merchant from the Ottoman heartland, a man who already owned several slaves and wanted another for his household in Istanbul. He watched Brigid closely as the bidding climbed. He examined her the way a farmer might assess an animal before purchase. Then he raised his hand one final time and offered more than anyone else. The auctioneer shouted, struck his staff against the platform, and the transaction was complete. Brigid was led away, still unable to understand a single word of what had just occurred, not yet realizing that the man who now held her chain was about to drag her into a world even more controlled and more dangerous than the market square. A world hidden behind high walls, where no law would offer her protection, and where her body would serve as both decoration and tool. Her journey into the harem was about to begin. In Istanbul, Brigid's entire existence collapsed into a courtyard, a hallway, and a door that locked from the outside. The voyage from Algiers had taken weeks in yet another lightless hold, this time packed with women from across Europe. Italian, Spanish, Greek, French. None of them spoke her language, but every one of them understood the same truth. There was no path back. When the ship reached the Bosphorus, guards drove them ashore and marched them directly to a large residence, concealed behind towering walls. Inside, other women took charge of her. They spoke fragments of different languages, enough to give commands. They stripped away her travel clothes and fed the rough fabric into a brazier, the material that had come from Ireland, still carrying the faint smell of peat smoke and salt air, turned to ash in seconds. They bathed her with perfumed water, combed through her hair, and dressed her in layered Ottoman garments, silk, cotton, soft slippers that made no sound on the stone floors. In the polished copper they held before her face, the girl from Baltimore had vanished. What stood in her place was someone else entirely, someone who belonged to this house whether she accepted it or not. That night her new owner arrived. His name was Hussein Aga, a prosperous merchant in his 40s who traded grain and textiles across the empire. He did not speak a word of English. He did not need to. The rules of this place did not require her consent or her comprehension. A servant brought Brigid to a room lit by oil lamps and withdrew, pulling the door shut behind her. Years later, she managed to send a letter home through a network of ransoming priests. It is one of the very few written testimonies that survive, from an Irish woman taken in the 1631 raid. In that letter she tried to describe her first night, but halfway through the account the ink trails off into nothing. She wrote that she begged God to let her die, that she prayed never to wake again, that every night after that first one was the same. Then she stopped. At the bottom of the page, in a different and more controlled hand, she simply added that words could not carry what had happened to her. This was the reality of the household harem, not silk and romance, not the fantasy paintings. Later produced in European studios by men who had never set foot inside such a place. The harem was a locked space where women existed at the disposal of their owner whenever he wanted them. It was a workplace, a prison, and a battlefield for survival, all hidden behind walls that most outsiders would never see. For women like Brigid, the first shock was physical. The second was psychological. There was no release date, no sentence to serve out, no judge to whom she could appeal. There was only the daily routine and the knowledge that someone else controlled every hour of it. Some women shattered under that weight. They screamed through the night, clawed at walls, or spoke to people who were not there. Others fell silent and stopped reacting to anything at all, barely moving unless physically pushed. Those who survived longer built small fortresses inside their minds. They created strict routines, folding and refolding the same garment, sweeping the same courtyard at the same hour each day, repeating prayers in their native tongue, even after learning new ones. They remembered songs from home and hummed them under their breath while working. They recited the names of rivers, churches, and hills from the IR childhood so they would not forget who they had once been. These habits did not set them free. They simply kept a tiny fragment of identity alive. Across North Africa and the Ottoman territories, the details of captivity shifted from house to house, city to city. But three patterns appeared almost everywhere. First, the pressure to convert never stopped. Priests and missionaries tried to prevent it. But inside the household they had no authority. Masters and overseers urged Christian slaves to embrace Islam. Conversion did not bring freedom, they remained property. But it opened slightly better paths within the system. Converted slaves sometimes received lighter duties, better food, or more trusted positions. Refusal brought punishment, beatings, extra labor, reduced rations, or confinement in dark rooms for days or weeks at a time. Many resisted as long as they could. Some surrendered, some only pretended. Second, they were forced to learn a new language. Turkish in Istanbul, Arabic in Algiers or Tunis, sometimes both. Orders were shouted in those tongues. Failure to understand meant blows. Women who picked up the language quickly could serve as interpreters, go-betweens within the household. That increased their usefulness and slightly improved their treatment. Those who struggled were labeled stubborn, lazy, or slow. The response was always the same: more pressure, more pain, until they learned or broke. Third, and most devastating, the law did not recognize them as full human beings with rights. A European slave could not testify in court against a free person. She could not own property. She could not leave the house without permission. If she was assaulted or abused, she had no official channel through which to complain. On paper she was an object, like a piece of furniture or a pack animal. She could be bought, sold, lent, or given away at her owner's will. Within this framework, women usually ended up in one of three situations. Many became domestic laborers. They rose before dawn to light fires, grind grain, haul water, scrub floors, wash clothes, and prepare food for large households. The work was heavy and relentless. Mistakes brought immediate punishment. Burning bread, spilling oil, breaking a dish. Any of these could mean a beating or being sent to bed hungry. These women rarely encountered anyone outside the family that owned them. Their world was a kitchen, a courtyard, and a sleeping mat in a corner. Years of labor under constant stress aged them rapidly. When they grew too weak to keep pace, they were sold to a poorer buyer or simply turned out onto the street to survive on their own. Others were kept as concubines. If a master found a woman attractive, he could claim her as a sexual partner without any ceremony. In wealthy houses, several concubines might live under the same roof, all competing for signs of favor, new clothes, jewelry, slightly better food. The unspoken rule was simple. The woman who bore a son gained status. Her position inside the house became more secure. She might even be freed later in life, but if she failed to produce children, or if the master lost interest, she could be returned to domestic work or sold to someone else. The third group experienced constant resale. They passed through multiple markets over their lifetime, sometimes bought and sold half a dozen times or more. Each sale meant a new city, new rules, new dangers. It also meant another round of public inspection in front of strangers. Some were traded across borders, moving from Algiers to Tunis, from Tunis to Tripoli, from there to Anatolia or the Balkans. Their memories became a chain of unfamiliar streets and unknown languages, each place marked only by the people who had owned them. Above all these private houses stood the most feared destination of all, the imperial harem in Istanbul. Contrary to legend, the harem was not a single room filled with lounging women draped in silk. It was a vast complex inside Topkapi Palace, the center of Ottoman power. There were more than 400 rooms of varying sizes. There were courtyards, gardens, kitchens, baths, classrooms, and corridors so long that some women spent years there without ever setting foot in certain sections. At its height, the imperial harem held between 500 and 1,000 women at once. It was a small city built entirely from female bodies and the servants who guarded them. Most of those women were not European. The majority came from the Caucasus region, Circassian and Georgian girls captured or sold by local rulers and traffickers. Ottoman elites considered them especially beautiful. But a minority came from farther away: Russia, Poland, the Balkans, and rarely Western Europe. These foreign women were treated like luxury goods. They were less common in the markets and attracted special attention. Entry into the imperial harem required passing through several layers of selection. The Sultan's agents traveled to major slave markets, watching auctions, inspecting captives, and asking questions. They searched for specific qualities: youth, physical health, symmetrical features, and a calm temperament that suggested the girl could learn quickly and follow orders. If a candidate seemed promising, they purchased her and sent her to Istanbul for further evaluation. Once there, the inspection grew even more intense. Palace doctors and senior attendants examined teeth, skin, eyes, and hair. They watched how new arrivals walked, how they responded to instructions, whether they displayed uncontrolled fear or anger. Many were rejected at this stage and sold instead to the households of high officials. Only a small percentage entered the inner training system of the harem itself. For those who did, life transformed yet again. They entered a strict hierarchy with clear ranks and titles. Older women who had served for years ran the place with iron discipline. They decided who cleaned, who cooked, who learned music, who assisted senior concubines. Newcomers started at the very bottom. They performed the most basic tasks and were constantly watched. Training lasted for years. The girls learned Turkish if they did not already speak it. They studied court etiquette, how to move, how to sit, how to serve coffee, how to address different officials, how to lower their eyes at precisely the right moment. They practiced music, dance, embroidery, and calligraphy. They were taught the stories and poetry that Ottoman elites expected to hear. The goal was to shape them into ideal companions for one man at the center of this world, the Sultan. But here is the cold statistical reality that destroys the fantasy. Even though hundreds of women lived inside the harem, only a small fraction ever saw the Sultan face to face. Estimates suggest perhaps 50 to 100 women in the entire complex would have any personal contact with him. Out of those, a handful, perhaps 5 to 10 over an entire reign, would spend nights with him and bear his children. The rest spent their lives waiting for a summons that never came. Year after year they watched younger arrivals replace them as favorites climbed the ladder. As they aged, their chances faded. Some were reassigned to serve the Sultan's mother, his official wives, or his children. Others became overseers of newer slaves, inflicting on others the same discipline they had once suffered themselves. And there was one more rule, harsh and absolute. When a sultan died, any woman in the harem who had not given him a child lost even the fragile status she had built. They were sent to another residence known as the Old Palace, a separate complex where former harem women lived out the remainder of their days. They did not marry. They did not leave. They existed in a kind of frozen time, waiting for a death that was, in many cases, the first real freedom they had known since childhood. Ottoman administrative records, dry and bureaucratic, offer rare glimpses into what this looked like for individuals. One document mentions a woman listed only as Katerina binti Yorgi, Katerina, daughter of George. She entered the imperial harem around 1650, probably captured somewhere on the Adriatic coast as a teenager. The registers track her across decades. She appears as a low-ranking servant, then as an assistant to higher-ranking women, then as an aging attendant and the Old Palace. She died in 1702 at roughly 67 years of age. The entry recording her death is brutally brief. It notes her number in the register, her origin as Franco, meaning Western European, and her status as deceased. That is all. No mention of her actual birthplace, no details of her family, no record of whether she ever laughed, cried, or loved anyone in that sealed world. 50 years inside palace walls, reduced to a line in a ledger and a number on an unmarked grave. This was the endpoint of the system for thousands of women. Not dramatic execution or heroic rescue, but slow disappearance. One day their names stopped appearing on the lists. Their clothes were given to someone else. Their sleeping mat was reassigned. The only proof they had ever existed was a fading line of ink in an account book. So why did this continue for so long? How could European rulers watch their people dragged away year after year, for 2.5 centuries and still fail to stop it? The answer reveals a great deal about power, profit, and how easily ordinary lives are sacrificed when they stand between nations and their interests. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe was too consumed with destroying itself to protect its own people. Catholic and Protestant kingdoms waged brutal religious wars that drained treasuries and filled graveyards. Armies trampled back and forth across the German states. France and Spain clashed for supremacy. England lurched through its own internal crises. Every nation watched its rival more carefully than it watched the southern horizon. Organizing a unified naval campaign against the Corsairs would have required operation, trust, and shared priorities. Instead, each state focused on its own battles and its own borders. Coastal villages paid the price for conflicts they had never chosen. Some governments even concluded that commerce with the Ottoman Empire and North African ports mattered more than the lives of ordinary captives. Venice depended on access to eastern markets. French kings cultivated alliances with Istanbul to counterbalance their Habsburg enemies. That meant treaties, careful diplomacy, and a great deal of looking the other way. As long as their merchants could move goods safely, rulers were unwilling to risk confrontation over the fate of fishermen, farmers, and small-town sailors who had been seized and sold. European cannons did thunder against Barbary ports from time to time. Spanish, Portuguese, and Maltese fleets raided coastal strongholds or attempted to liberate galley slaves. But these actions were scattered, short-lived, and often aimed more at revenge than at dismantling the system itself. They did not endure. The Corsair economy adapted, shifted bases, rebuilt fleets, and continued. Worse still, some Europeans joined in. Renegades like Simon the Dancer are only the most famous examples. Others became shipbuilders, translators, moneylenders, or brokers in the slave markets. They handled letters, counted coins, and negotiated ransoms. They knew precisely what happened to the people whose names and prices they recorded in their ledgers. They did it anyway. There is no way to tell this story honestly without acknowledging that Christians as well as Muslims profited from it. Out of this disorder grew a strange grinding machine called the ransom system. Church orders such as the Trinitarians and Mercedarians sent men to North Africa to negotiate for captives. Families back home scraped together money. City councils levied special taxes. Charitable donors contributed alms for the redemption of prisoners. Lists of names were read aloud in churches and collections taken. When enough funds had been gathered for one person, a priest or agent would attempt to locate that captive, bargain with the owner, and bring them home. On paper, this sounds like mercy. In practice, it created another cruel hierarchy. Wealthy merchants and nobles could raise ransom money quickly. Their sons and daughters often returned within a few years. In some cities, rich families even purchased insurance against the captivity of their ship-owning relatives. Middle-class families struggled longer but sometimes succeeded. The poorest had almost no chance. A fisherman's wife or an orphaned servant girl could wait for decades. Most never saw their homeland again. Lijsbeth van Rijn, the Dutch woman seized near Spain, was one of the rare exceptions. After she vanished, her relatives in Holland refused to surrender hope. They sold tools, furniture, and even a small piece of land that had belonged to the family for generations. They begged their church and their town council for assistance. It took 8 years to gather enough, roughly 200 guilders, a crushing sum for ordinary people. During those 8 years, Lijsbeth lived as a slave in North Africa. She worked in a merchant's household, first as a general servant, later as a kind of assistant to the woman who managed the home. She learned to speak some Arabic. She learned the rhythm of markets and prayer calls. She lived under constant threat of being sold again. Her owner considered it a good arrangement when a European priest arrived with a bag of money and an offer to purchase her freedom. She had already contributed 8 years of labor and could now be converted into cash to acquire a younger replacement. When Lijsbeth finally stepped onto a ship heading north, she believed she was returning to her life. She pictured her fiancé waiting on the dock. She imagined her mother's embrace. She thought the nightmare was ending, but captivity had lasted long enough to shatter the world she remembered. By the time she reached home in 1739, everything had shifted. Her fiancé had married another woman years earlier. Everyone had told him that Lijsbeth was almost certainly dead. Her mother, worn down by grief and illness, had passed away 2 years after the capture. Her father was still alive, but the effort of raising her ransom had destroyed his finances. The farm was gone. He worked as a labourer now, dependent on the charity of others. The neighbours did not welcome her as a hero. They whispered. They stared. For them, a woman who had spent years in a Muslim household carried a stain that never washed away. They assumed things about what had happened to her, about what she had been forced to do. It did not matter that she had never chosen any of it. In their eyes she was marked forever. Men who had once flirted with her now avoided her. No one wanted to marry a woman with that kind of history. Lijsbeth never built the life she had imagined. Instead, she rented a small room and survived by working as a seamstress. He saved enough to purchase paper and ink. In old age, she wrote down her memories, line after line in a careful hand. Those pages ended up in Dutch archives, forgotten for centuries. On one of the final pages, she admitted something that still strikes hard today. She wrote that sometimes she wished she had died in North Africa instead of returning home. At least there, she said, her shame was hidden. In Holland it was public, and it would follow her to the grave. Her story was not unique. Many who did manage to return discovered they no longer had a place. Captivity had changed them. Time had changed their communities, the people who had prayed for their return did not know how to handle the survivors standing before them, so they turned away. The Corsair system did not end because of a sudden wave of moral awakening. It ended because power shifted. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, European navies were stronger, more organized, and less reluctant to confront the North African states that sheltered Corsairs. Britain, the Netherlands, and later the United States fought naval engagements in the Mediterranean. Warships bombarded coastal fortresses and forced some rulers to sign treaties limiting or renouncing privateering. But the decisive blow came from France. In 1816, British and Dutch fleets pounded Algiers with heavy bombardment to pressure its ruler. The assault damaged the Corsair infrastructure but did not destroy it entirely. Over the following decade, raids continued on a smaller scale. Then in 1830, France invaded Algeria outright. French troops seized Algiers, overthrew its ruler, and began a long and brutal conquest of the interior. The invasion had multiple motives: imperial ambition, internal French politics, economic opportunity. But one of its consequences was the final dismantling of the official slave markets and the Corsair system that had flourished there for centuries. No more state-sanctioned raiding fleets departed Algerian harbours to sweep European coasts. No more public auctions of newly captured Christians took place in the main squares. By the middle of the 19th century, the age of Barbary Corsairs was over. By that time, historians estimate that more than 1 million Europeans had been taken. Most of them never returned. Their names are scattered through parish records, ransom lists, and bureaucratic registers from Dublin to Dubrovnik. Often all that survives is a single line: taken by Turks, lost to the Moors, vanished at sea. The women are even harder to trace. They married into new societies, disappeared into palace complexes, or died under foreign roofs with no one left who knew where they had been born. About Brigid O'Callaghan, the girl dragged from Baltimore on that night in 1631, the historical record for individuals like her is thin, but some traces remained in local memory. For years after the raid, the church in Baltimore read out a list of the missing at Sunday services. Names of men, women, and children were spoken aloud, and prayers offered for their return. Brigid's name was on that list. Week after week, year after year, the congregation answered amen into a silence that never broke. Brigid herself spent decades inside the Ottoman world. After the first brutal years in Husayn Aga's house, she learned enough Turkish to understand commands and enough of the local customs to avoid the worst punishments. She watched new girls arrive, crying and stunned, just as she had once been. She watched older slaves grow sick and be sold away. Time blurred, seasons changed. Empires rose and fell far away. Inside the walls, her routine remained almost the same. At some point, perhaps after Husayn's death, perhaps as an act of calculated piety, she was manumitted. In many Muslim societies of the era, freeing slaves was considered a charitable act, especially near the end of a person's life. A man who had owned human beings for decades might attempt to balance his conscience and his reputation by releasing a few of them. Freedom, however, came with nothing attached. No home, no income, no path back to Ireland. Brigid left the house where she had spent most of her adult life, carrying a small bundle of clothes and almost no idea what to do next. She attached herself to a community of other freed Christians and still enslaved women who maintained some contact with European priests in Istanbul. Through them, she finally managed to send that letter back to Ireland, the one that described her first night and then broke off. She asked if anyone from her family still lived, if Baltimore still existed, if she was remembered. We do not know if a reply ever reached her. We do know that for decades her name was read in that village church. Then, slowly, the list of captives shortened. People assumed the missing were dead. New generations grew up who had never known the faces behind the names. One Sunday, the priest unrolled a fresh list with fewer names. Brigid's was no longer on it. The prayers moved on to other concerns. Some versions of the story say that she eventually returned in old age, landing on the Irish coast after half a lifetime abroad, only to find a place she barely recognized. The harbour had changed. Houses had been rebuilt after the raid. Families she had known were gone. Her parents were long dead. Her childhood friends were buried or scattered. In that version, she walked through streets where no one knew who she was. The girl taken in chains was now a weathered stranger with an accent shaped by foreign words. Whether or not that detail is literally true, it captures a deeper fact. Captivity had turned her into someone who did not fully belong anywhere. This is the heart of the story that Europe tried to forget. Not just the raids and the markets and the numbers, but the lives bent out of shape by a system that treated human beings as cargo. It is the story of women like Brigid, Lijsbeth, Katerina, and thousands of others whose names we will never know. Women who learned new languages under threat, who adapted to new religions and customs just enough to survive, who carried invisible scars that followed them even if they somehow made it home. The coasts of Ireland still remember the Sack of Baltimore. The archives of Istanbul, Algiers, and European port cities still hold letters, registers, and petitions filled with traces of this traffic. Each dry entry on a list points to a human life that was split into before and after by the sound of a door breaking in the night. When we discuss slavery in history, we often think of one direction, ships crossing the Atlantic from Africa to the Americas. That story absolutely matters. But it is not the only one. For centuries, the Mediterranean was also a highway for human bondage running in multiple directions. Forgetting any part of that map means misunderstanding the full picture of how power and exploitation worked. You know this story now. You have walked from a burning Irish village to the markets of Algiers, into the courtyards of Istanbul, through the ledger books of palace officials, and back to cold northern harbours where freed captives came home to find nothing waiting for them. The question is what you do with that knowledge. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If you want more hard, hidden history told without softening the edges, make sure you subscribe and hit the like button so you do not miss the next video. Share this episode with someone who still thinks they know the complete story of slavery in the Mediterranean. And tell me in the comments which culture, empire, or forgotten chapter you want us to explore next.